Tonight, panic in students as police put a Toronto high school in lockdown on suspicions of gun possession. And an Indian state government bulldozes a 16th century mosque because it wants to widen the road. Later in the show, we look at the recent updates on the war in Ukraine.
There's an awful lot of suffering, an awful lot of disruption, not just within Ukraine, but for the rest of the world as well.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening. This is the Muslim News Canada on Muslim Network TV. I am Saamiyah Syed. A student arrested by police yesterday for the possession of a firearm has been released with no charges. The news comes after panic rushed through the students of Mark Garneau Collegiate in Toronto around 12:30 p.m. when someone shouted, quote, "gun." According to one of the students, someone pulled out something that looked black from their backpack in a fight during the lunch hour. The collegiate was put on lockdown. In an update today, the police say no gun was recovered. This is the second time in a week a Toronto school has been put on lockdown due to a police investigation. Canadians detained in Kurdish-controlled camps in Syria will be coming home, promises the Canadian government. Lawrence Greenspan, the lawyer representing them, says the repatriation agreement includes 6 women and 13 children. Greenspan said he received the confirmation for repatriation on Thursday morning. According to the agreement, the Canadians will return within a mutually agreed-upon timeframe. He says the agreement excludes the repatriation of 4 men who are also willing to return. Barbara Jackman, a lawyer representing one of the men detained in Syria, says there is no reason why they should not be repatriated along with the women and children. A British judge has rejected a lawsuit that alleges the British government let cotton products made through forced labor in East Turkestan into the UK. In the ruling, the judge says he acknowledges the widespread abuses in the region. However, he ruled against the Uyghur organization's claim that the British government did not thoroughly investigate the conditions in which the cotton is made. East Turkestan is a major supplier of cotton products. For a long time, Uyghur activists have alleged laborers picking cotton are Muslim and Turkic minorities. According to these groups, these laborers are subject to inhumane treatment. A state government in India has demolished a 500-year-old mosque under the pretext of a road widening. A video posted on social media shows the demolition of a large part of Allahabad Shahi Mosque in the state of Uttar Pradesh. The mosque was built in the 16th century. This is just the latest in a series of attacks on Indian Muslims who make up 13% of India's population. Under India's ruling Hindu Bharatiya Janata Party, there have been many attacks on mosques. Hindu extremists have destroyed in 1992 another 16th century building, the Babri Mosque. The incident led to widespread violence, killing at least 2,000 Indians. Now, it has been nearly a year since Russia invaded Ukraine. There have been many developments since then, talks about a peace offer, discussions on energy and transportation, and much more. But here to give us the latest updates is Dr. Arne Kislenko, an associate professor at Toronto Metropolitan University and an instructor at Trinity College, University of Toronto. Welcome to the show, Dr. Arne, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Arne, can you give us an update of the current situation? What does the war in Ukraine look like right now?
Well, the war in Ukraine is at a very critical juncture for the obvious reasons that it's been a year, and very clearly the Russian objectives, at least the ones that were stated by Putin and his government, have never been achieved. So what that means is that we are in a kind of holding pattern to see exactly what it is that Russia's new objectives are going to be. Is Putin interested in continuing a very unsuccessful war with the rather obvious results of a great deal of suffering for people? Is Ukraine going to press on? It's made some substantial territorial gains against the Russians and is now back into the eastern parts of the country, which were annexed by Russia. How far will it go in defending its country, trying to reintegrate its countries? And of course, the other major issue involved in all of this is the continuing response from the Western world. So all of those are unanswerable questions at this stage. And I think it's important to note that within those kind of parameters, there's an awful lot of suffering, an awful lot of disruption, not just within Ukraine, but for the rest of the world as well.
And I'll touch upon that later on in this interview, but you mentioned something about Russia's objectives. For those of us who don't know what those objectives are, can you please share of what the objectives look like, or what do you presume that they will be?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because there is a sort of official answer to that in terms of what Putin and his government has made clear, and then a lot of questions about what he really wants, or where his bottom line will really be. So, officially, this isn't even a war for Russia and its people, which is ludicrous. But of course, that's the nature of this government. So this is some sort of excursion, military action. I think increasingly Putin has been forced to acknowledge that it's far bigger and worse than he previously articulated. What exactly Russia wants is a question mark, because it said it only wanted the eastern territories, the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass and Luhansk and so on. But then it invaded the rest of Ukraine in order to get it. Depending on who you talk to and when you ask them the question, Russian officials vary. They often say this is about those provinces, and some other ones say it's in effect about the extermination of the Ukrainian nation. So I don't know that that's as clear as we would like it to be. If everybody knew exactly what Russia's intentions or bottom line was, I think it would be a far easier question for everybody. But I don't even know, to be totally honest with you, that Putin understands what Russia wants anymore, given how poorly this has gone. So this is again a critical juncture, not just for obviously Ukrainians or their allies, but also for Russia and Russians. I don't know that these are answerable questions, because we know so very little about Putin as intention.
So it seems like it's also a time to reevaluate some priorities.
Yeah, the only thing that there I don't know there is any reevaluation of is the I don't know how else to put it. The tremendous resolve and courage of the Ukrainian people. No matter what one's view is on Zelensky or his government or Ukraine as a nation, I think it's impossible to deny that they have done collectively a job that nobody thought they could do, and frankly, including most experts like me, when the war, alleged experts like me, when the war broke, people assumed this would be over with quickly, that Ukraine would be forced into a capitulation, probably wouldn't exist anymore in the form that it had, and the exact opposite has happened. So this brings up a whole sea of unanswered questions and of things that we didn't consider before, not just about Ukraine, but about Russia.
I think that begs the question then, what does the peace talks look like right now? We've heard some word about it, but doesn't seem to have yielded any fruits of its labor. So what do you think these peace talks have come to right now?
Well, that again, a great question. The problem is they don't really exist in any tangible sense, in part because of the intransigence of actually both sides. And you can understand Ukraine's position. Why would Ukraine, having made these significant military advances and having thwarted Russia's interests, why would you sue for a peace that invariably would end up you losing Ukrainian territory? So I think, as many people are, maybe thinking that Zelensky and his government should sue for a peace or something, but given what's transpired, you can understand their reluctance to do so. And then on the other hand, you have Putin, who frankly, he and his government cannot be trusted. I don't know why, even academics sort of looking from the outside in imagine that what he says is actually going to translate into anything serious, because he is in a desperate position. He is an authoritarian leader who really has no need to worry about domestic public opinion, at least until this point. So he says all sorts of different things, none of which he necessarily intends to pursue. And then really the crux of that peace initiative idea is that he would be forced, under current circumstances at least, he would be forced to settle for something that is the exact opposite of what he did this for in the first place. So it would be basically a humiliation for him. None of his objectives have been achieved, for all intents and purposes. So for him to turn around to the global community and his own populace and say, here's a peace initiative, most people would see it and probably publicly chastise him for the fact that this is not at all what we went to war for. So it really wouldn't be an equitable peace in his mind, and therefore he's unlikely to pursue it. So we come back to this idea of an intractable war.
Mm-hmm. Now, when the war first broke out last year, there was some talk that international bodies or even countries would pressure Russia into receding from the war, but clearly that hasn't happened yet. Do you think it's going to happen, or what does the chance of that look like?
Yeah, I wish I had that crystal ball. I think everybody does. There is the chance. First of all, economic sanctions have taken a bite out of Russia. It's very clearly starting to affect, your average Russians. We don't know enough about Russian public opinion, let's call it that, if in fact it exists. I know a lot of people would like to see the Russian populace rise up against him, do something. We have seen demonstrations of significant protests there. So all of that means that if this war continues, particularly if it continues as poorly as it has for Russia and Russians, there is obviously the likelihood or the possibility of more disruption in Russia, more protest, more of Putin's alienation, isolation. So that's a calculation that could move forward. But the reality is we haven't seen very much organized or very spectacular opposition to him in the streets or from within his own regime. So ultimately, it translates into a sort of holding pattern. I liken him to be really, basic about it. I liken Putin right now to being sort of like a cornered animal. He's in a dangerous position because he hasn't delivered any of the goods. He's clearly, been defeated in a lot of absolute ways. He's had a sort of, parade of military leaders come through, none of which have really made the difference. And that needs more and more military, more and more people. There is, of course, a possible new conscription into the Russian armed forces. And that is going to really exacerbate the tensions in Russia. So from my perspective, in addition to the obvious suffering for Ukraine and global effects from the war, the attention now focuses to where Russia is headed with this, Russian people are headed with this. And we just don't know enough about that.
Mm-hmm. And what has the Canadian involvement in the war looked like so far?
Well, Canada is significant in the sense that we have a very large Ukrainian diasporic population here. And also Canada is a frontline member of NATO. It is a significant world power in that extent. We are selling weapons to the Ukrainians and giving, of course, political support, refugee support, money. But I'm very realistic, perhaps overly so. Canada is not the greatest power in the world in any real sense of the word. So Ukraine very politely, of course, acknowledges and embraces Canadian support, but Canada is limited in our capacity, even within what I just said. So real attentions are elsewhere. If you're Ukrainian, the deals that need to be made are very, very clearly with the United States and the EU and the constituent members of those. And Canada is folded into that, but, Canada has limited authority. Plus, let's be honest with you, Russia doesn't really consider Canada on its international security sort of horizons. It has the same people in mind, the same agencies in mind. So we're important. I'm not saying, who cares about Canada. I'm just saying that Canadians need to be realistic about the extent of influence we have. That being said, Canada's response has been very clear, and that's good. We stand for values and ideas here in this country, and those should be independent of where the problem is or who is involved in the problem. Those principles and ideas are chief. They're integral to civil society and to democracy. Those are values certainly I and I think many millions of Canadians hold dear. And the government, and I think most Canadians beyond the government, have called this.
Canada is clearly not as much of a superpower as it can be on the global scale. But thank you so much, Dr. Arn, for coming on and sharing more about the latest updates on the war in Ukraine. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
You are watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. That's it from our Toronto studios tonight. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more Canadian Muslim content. Stay safe, and until next time.